for Monday, October 23rd, 2023. This time is 7:03. All rise for allegiance. Consideration of the agenda for this evening. Our purpose is it's a special meeting to review Articles 7 through 10, 12, and 14, or whichever ones we can get through tonight, of the draft zoning ordinance. Any questions or concerns about the agenda? Hearing none, may I get a motion to approve the agenda as drafted?
So moved.
Second?
I'll second.
Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The agenda is approved. Move on to, is there anyone that has a conflict of interest with tonight's agenda? Not? Any public comments for this evening? We had a written statement, correct, or a written letter?
Yeah, there's a written letter on your desk from Rita Service.
I don't have a copy of it in front of me.
I don't know, it says Sarah, Jackie, and
Oh,
planning commissioner.
oh, there it is, okay.
Yep.
Thanks. So I guess maybe, should we just read it really quickly? I'm happy to read it. Everybody okay with that? So this is from Rita's Service. As a resident of the Torch Lake Township and member of the ZBA, I would request that the PC review the definition of a structure. The matter came before the ZBA on July 8th, 2020, as a result of Mr. Spencer witnessing large construction equipment actually in Torch Lake's water, building a rock wall, and as such requested an interpretation of a structure definition. My request is that you review this interpretation as described in the ZBA minutes for the July 8th, 2020 meeting. The motion that was made stated unencumbered rocks, boulders, or any kind of riprap placed for shoreline stabilization or landscape without the use of rebar, cement, or other substance that secures rocks from moving is not a structure in accordance with the Torch Lake Township zoning ordinance, chapter 23, definition of a structure. The motion of this interpretation passed 3-2. Unsatisfied with this decision, Mr. Spencer brought the issue to the 13th District Court in December 2020. Judge Thomas Power ruled that Mr. Spencer had no standing. However, Judge Power went on in his opinion to state that only in Torch Lake Township are the Egyptian pyramids in Machu Picchu not considered structures. As our current definition is silent and we only have this, in my opinion, a nonsensical interpretation, I brought this issue up on the August 9th, 2023 ZBA training with our ZNA Township attorney. Mr. Millar said that there are two ways to deal with the interpretation. One, amend the current ordinance to address the issue, lay it out so it negates the interpretation. Two, wait for another case to ask for an interpretation. As the Giza Pyramid is considered one of the seven wonders of the ancient world and Machu Picchu is one of the seven wonders of the new world, I would respectfully request the PC review the July 8th, 2020 interpretation of a structure. Sincerely, Rita Service. Any other public comments for tonight? Any other correspondence? Okay. So with that, we will move into the main agenda items. Draft zoning ordinance Article 7. Maybe before we do there, I would comment on the letter. I do think that we should take a hard look at that. I could see where that could be, interpretation of that or lack thereof, the ability to interpret could be a problem. So when would be the natural time to look at that, at least in association with our current ordinance, or the draft one, I should say?
With the draft, so there's already a comment that I had on structure being, is this holistic enough? What about portions of the structure like an eave, which must have come up during our conversation at one time through this process. So in the draft, I think when we get into definitions, which is Article 14, it would be good to have that conversation, try to see what you're getting at and what you're regulating. This situation with the rocks and the boulders that the ZBA heard about, I believe that was located near the water or on the waterfront. So if it's something that we're just trying to help or assist in the waterfront, maybe we need to look at types of structures that end up in the waterfront setback, what we want to allow there or not allow there. Or we can go down the structure definition, call something out separately. The definition of structures, and I mentioned this briefly to Andy before the meeting, is always one that is tested over and over again and very difficult to deal with because you're always including everything or not including enough. My example was in one of the communities I worked in, it ended up being that a drain field for a septic system turned out to be a structure based on the definition, and it had to meet setbacks from the zoning ordinance, even though the health department is the one that regulates them. And typically in zoning, we're not regulating septic systems or drain fields, but just depending on how broad you get on the definition. So it's something that we should look at in our draft zoning ordinance. If it's something you want to try to deal with faster than that, then we'd have to do a separate amendment to our current ordinance. So the way that it works is that that ZBA ruling stands. So even though the definition hasn't been amended, we have to apply it in the way that the ZBA interpreted it. So if we want to interpret it differently than what the ZBA said we should, then we would need to amend it outside of the draft. If you're comfortable saying, we've gone on this long, let's wait for the draft to go through, and maybe you want it to be interpreted exactly that same way, then we should just write that language for the definition of structure in the draft so that it becomes written and you don't have to know that this interpretation happened for enforcing the ordinance. But it also gives you the opportunity in this draft to say, we don't like this, and we want to create different language.
So given where we are in the current draft of the new ordinance, we've likely tonight and one more maybe meeting, we should be pretty much ready to move ahead with it.
Yeah, and I believe that at that meeting that Rita mentioned, that training meeting, I had said the planning commission would be working through it in our draft zoning ordinance. So we are getting very close on that. Knowing that you still have to have a public hearing and then it does have to be approved by the township board. We're getting close. The next couple of months, I think, would be something that it could become effective unless it gets, bogged down in public hearing or township board level. And we could always evaluate it at that time. Say for some reason the zoning ordinance stalls, we could say, okay, we find this to be important. We want to come back and work on that definition specifically.
Seems to me that's the prudent course is to take it up in the draft ordinance. Others agree? Yeah. Okay, good. By the way, wasn't this structure definition also an issue in the ZBA with the big pad that was
The helicopter pad?
helicopter pad?
Yeah, it did come up during that discussion about the rebar and if there was rebar in the concrete pad that they put down, and there was rebar in that. So I think that's kind of how this interpretation even kind of bubbled back up again.
Yeah.
Was because of that case and if that was a structure.
Okay. So I think we should dive into Article 7.
Okay.
Unless there's anything or any questions, comments, anything from last time that we want to.
I had it noted that Sarah was going to enlighten us as to the nasty wording. I have to go back and look. What did it say? the troubling language in our current zoning on wineries and breweries, 6.28.
That's right.
The troubling wording on which?
6.28, wineries, breweries.
Yeah, because I had said that some of that language had changed. Well, let me go there. which wineries and breweries, that's going to be in Article 6 in the draft, but it's currently in kind of a funny place in Article 3. In the current one, let me find it. So it's 3E, microbreweries, microdistilleries, I believe. Although I thought there was wineries somewhere. Oh, this is it. Yes. Activities associated with wineries, meaderies, and cideries, which is 2.26.3. So these are kind of like accessory uses to a winery or a brewery. And I guess I actually did just not bring any of this over in your ordinance, because these are typically, like wedding events at a winery or a brewery is like the very general. It would be in addition to weddings, it can also be, baby showers, gatherings, gatherings where you rent out your barn essentially, or your winery for events to happen. And what happens is that a lot of times communities try to regulate these so strictly and put so many regulations in that you kind of overstep your ability to zone or regulate. Because everything that you're doing as the planning commission is supposed to be based in the public health, safety, and welfare. That's what we're here to do and to serve. And so you don't want to overstep that boundary by taking too much from someone through the process. So I just find that this language in general becomes kind of overly restrictive, and there's a lot of kind of bumps that happen along the way. And this is how these uses typically have been handled in the past. Kind of moving forward, they need to be a little bit more streamlined and rely more just on your special use standards than talking about, there's an activity log that's in here that you're supposed to turn in. The zoning administrator is
What
supposed to
section
be able
is
to
this again? 6?
2.26.3.
Oh, 2 point.
Actually, it's all 2.26 is wineries, cideries, and meaderies. And then it talks about in the ag district, permitted use is a winery, cidery, and meadery. They have to be licensed. They have to be 10 acres. So that component, that's your winery, that language is still in the draft ordinance. That was brought over, and that is in Article 6. So somebody can have a winery. And I know we briefly talked about that at last month's meeting, if it were appropriate to have like a winery in your ag district, what that looks like for that. So that component did come over. And so with a winery, naturally, with your winery and your winery license from the state, you have the ability to have a tasting room there. You have the ability to sell your wine direct to customers there. So kind of think of all of the small little wineries you see around the countryside. That's what's allowed with this winery license.
And it would be a special use permit though, correct? Or not?
Correct. I think so. Now I need to double check.
I mean, wineries in general would seem like the type of business that we would like to encourage.
So what do we do? Also, we went from winery, brewery, meadery, and we got rid of meadery and added distilleries.
Yeah, because a meadery is a winery. And under
Okay.
state licensing, mead is considered a wine.
Okay.
So we allow them by right in the commercial district. That's not a special use. It would just be by right.
What about an egg?
In the ag district,
It's like a special use.
is it special in the ag? Which I think is appropriate.
I agree.
Totally agree with that.
But yeah, so I guess I just did not bring over the language about the associated activities.
What about village business?
Does anywhere have enough acreage?
Special use.
So the other place it's by right is commercial. then we're
Correct.
saying. Then that's,
So, and it's in, village. So village is all, like village residential and village business, it's a special use. But in the village business, let me double check here. In the village business, it becomes by right. Because in the village business, it allows everything that is allowed in residential, no matter what that approval process is, unless we list it specific as a special use. So if it's got frontage directly on 31, 88, or Barnes Park, it's village business and it would be allowed by right.
But does anyone have enough as the parcels are today to even?
Right,
add
because
up
you have
to
to have
that?
10 acres, so.
Yeah.
There isn't 10 acres.
Right, it's not gonna be in the village. It might be one of the commercial properties, might have 10 acres type of thing.
but, and so commercial, I think it seems totally appropriate. The village business, that's where the issue, but if we're saying we don't have any village business parcels that are 10 acres,
Right.
by definition, it's a moot point.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing to say they couldn't put together 10 acres, but I don't think that's very realistic. I just make that comment because you could always combine parcels, but to get to 10 acres with those parcels down there, I just don't see it.
And 5 of it has to be planted according to this.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah, it's just not.
Okay.
unlikely to ever happen, right?
If you want to, say in your commercial district, if you wanted to allow it without the plantings, we could break that out. So in the ag district, you're required to have the plantings, and in the commercial, maybe you don't require as much acreage
Yeah.
or the plantings in that district.
That
That
would-
you could
that
do
would be more like a tasting room, right? Rather than a
Right.
winery. Not
Yeah,
necessarily making anything there, but
right. And we do allow
Right,
for the
so-
tasting rooms as a separate use listed there too.
So we are going to modify the commercial,
It would be up to you. If you want me to, we could modify the commercial component to reduce the acreage or the planted requirements for it.
I don't see a reason, I mean, bottom line, if somebody has it, they can do it, well, they can do it by right, but they're bound by the current acreage requirements. I think we just leave it, unless anybody has a heartburn on that.
And we could, when we go through the master planning process, maybe get more details from everybody,
Yeah.
what they'd like to see about wineries and breweries.
Okay.
but there
Anything
is a
else?
separate, sorry,
Oh, go ahead.
there is a separate, oh yes, for tasting rooms.
Tasting rooms, though, don't have, I don't think, any Article 6 standards with them. They're just listed as a use
Right.
in the districts.
But they have to go through the regulatory environment
Right.
for establishment with
Yeah.
alcohol.
Right. I guess-
Overall, that doesn't sound very troubling. All
No.
of it. No. Okay. I was expecting something like, whoa.
So that's where something like in your commercial district where somebody may not be able to have 10 acres or grow their grapes there, but they still can open up their little tasting room there and bring in their product from somewhere else and have a tasting room. Similar to a restaurant. I mean, I understand that tasting rooms typically don't have food. They don't prepare food typically there or meals there, but from a township perspective, I don't understand limiting that in your commercial district to that. Like I treat them almost like restaurants. You know, if you allow a restaurant that has a liquor license, what's the difference between a tasting room that serves food? If the state wants to restrict what they can serve at their tasting room or how they can do that, that's a different discussion, but that's at the state level. But locally, I think it functions more like a restaurant or a bar than something different in your commercial districts anyways. In the ag district, I have a different argument, but we'll just stick to the
Completely agree.
Okay. We'll leave that as is for now, and you can kind of think about it some more, and we can always circle back to it, either next time we look at the complete draft or after the master plan or during the master plan.
So on to Article 7.
Article 7. So Article 7 kind of starts your big clump of, these are very important articles, but they're very dry. There's not a lot of discretion from the planning commission's perspective. We're here to check all the boxes for you. So site plan review, this is laid out differently. It has different approval criteria than your current ordinance has. And it also has kind of this checklist through there. Your current ordinance does have a long list of items that are required to be on a site plan, just like we have in this application requirement checklist here, but we just laid it out a little bit differently, hopefully to help you see if you can do it either on a site plan or a narrative, but also so somebody could just print out these couple of pages and you can literally go down and check them off as an activity for that.
Does raise a question about what
Yeah.
we talked about with structures. I mean, right there in the first sentence of 7.1, it talks about the structure for standards for uses and structures, which site plan approval is required under the ordinance. So do we get ourselves afoul of the definition of structure currently requiring rebar?
No, because it's, no. I think it's fine in there. Because sometimes you only have structures, like if you're putting an accessory building, say on a grocery store, that'll require site plan review because it's a commercial use. And still, even though maybe your home accessory building structure doesn't require site plan review, it's got a little bit different process. So, no, I think that's appropriate right there.
I mean, subject to the interpretation of the zoning board, the definition in the draft is completely different.
Yes.
So
So, and this is saying your site plan is required for all new uses and structures except for your 1 family and 2 family. So those are just approved in the office with a land use permit. The accessory buildings related to those and ag buildings are all exempt essentially from site plan review. And then an expansion that doesn't increase more than 25% of a building.
Is the 25% the same as what it is in the current ordinance?
I don't think so. And actually, I said that wrong because you're required to do that. Yeah. No, I said that right. The current ordinance, I think, has it pretty much for everything except for single family, 2 family, and accessory buildings. I don't think it has some of that flexibility for the expansion. I'm going to look real quick though.
And as you're looking, so if you took Eastport Market, and if they wanted to expand their footprint by 20%, they could under this without a site plan review?
Let me read it again.
yep.
They could. Seems like we would want them to something like that. And I'm not trying to incur a bunch of bureaucracy and a bunch of site plan reviews. When you think of it in terms of a larger business in the community like that, and a larger building to start with, or do we care?
25% would be a significant,
Yeah,
for example. Not picking on them, certainly. But
right.
But in the village business, we only allow a maximum up to 3,000 square feet. That is not a special use permit. So they're already over that size. So it's basically a special use permit. It's a major amendment. They'd end up having to come back.
They would,
Yeah, it ends up being kind of circular to get there, but.
because they're
Hmm.
already out of compliance. I see.
Right.
So if you look at it in terms of.
It's already, yeah.
Yeah, so in that district, because of the limited size on it, it would automatically kick it into a special use permit.
Now, how about a parcel in the commercial? Or not a parcel, but a structure in the commercial?
Structure in the commercial, it would not, that's one of the locations that it would,
They would just be able to do it.
right, potentially, yeah.
I don't feel that strongly about it, but how do others feel?
The thing that, and we could change that language about the 25% if you're not comfortable with that. So any special use automatically is going to. So if somebody changes the use and it's a special use, the special use permit requires a site plan to be done. So this would be if something's a permitted use and getting changed to a permitted use, say, I don't have a good example, but one permitted use to another grocery store, to some other retail or something like that. This would say you wouldn't be required to do a site plan, go through site plan review for that process because it's interior. And you're just changing the use. They'd still have to comply with the ordinance, so they'd still have to update their parking or anything like that to meet the ordinance with the change in use. They just aren't doing a site plan review. But then the 25% does allow that additional flexibility if somebody wants to put a small addition on.
There aren't that many businesses that are that large, right? I mean,
Right.
25% is,
And I'm just trying to imagine if it was a large building. I mean, I think you're concerned, if it's already large, and they're gonna add another 25%. But wouldn't all the other specs or
Mhm.
kick in, like, the easements or all that
Right.
stuff? So I'm trying to imagine, how would it become a problem? Or would it kick in some other?
The only difference would be the level of detail they would be required to provide, essentially. So if they're falling into this item B, they could do like a plot plan and just get a land use permit and deal with it in the office versus going through or submitting a site plan that had its full-blown, all the requirements on it. So they still have to comply with the ordinance. You're right, all the requirements.
So to go back to the example, not to pick on them, but they're one of the largest buildings. So the Village Market, if they happen to be located in a commercial sector, they could add 24.9% to it without having to go through a site plan.
Why am I not reading that? So B, expansion or renovation of existing use other than uses maybe listed and above, which increases existing floor space
Yep.
more than 25%. And the uses above being one family, two family.
Yes.
So I need it unless one family, two family.
So what are we looking at?
I'm just not getting where it says that, I'm reading B as in, we need a site plan review unless, for an expansion, unless I'm, as in seen in A, one family, two family ag. But am I reading it wrong?
which increases the floor space by more than 25%.
So-
24%, they wouldn't.
So if I'm 25% though, I need it.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I thought you said no, okay.
Well, technically, 25 exactly, you wouldn't. 25.1, you would. But I think I'm fine with it. We're probably splitting hairs. To me, that was just one thing that jumped out. But if nobody else really has a concern, I don't feel that strongly about it. I think in general, it's a good guideline. I'm trying to make it a little easier for people.
Then moving on to standards for approval.
All seemed reasonable to me.
Right, and these are all things that are supposed to be on your site plan anyways, and that you're making sure they're complying with the zoning ordinance. And then site plan application requirements. You know, I continue to try to make this list smaller, and it always continues to grow throughout time because you always find additional information that's helpful to be on your site plan.
The checklist that's on page, I guess, 117. Do we have something like that today or not? Sort
It
of-
is, but it's just a bunch, you know, one and it's words. I mean, it's similar,
Yeah.
it's just laid out differently. So the review procedures in here is a little bit different. A little bit different than what's in your current ordinance. I mean, I think this is procedurally how things go. I think it's just a little bit more clear. If you like the structure of this, we can create a graphic that shows you visually, you know, step one, step two, how that goes. So this has the conceptual review pre-application meeting. That is required for all site plans in this ordinance, that an applicant needs to come in and talk to the zoning administrator and get that feedback. Your current ordinance does have this pre-application, but it also includes like the planning commission chair and other people. I like to keep the planning commission chair neutral and out of the meeting. That's not a public meeting. So took that language out. This is just dealing with staff, you know, and typically staff is your most knowledgeable of your zoning ordinance anyways. Versus, I mean, not to say anything, you know, but like you don't read the ordinance every day,
What are
so.
you trying to say?
You know, you can give your opinion about if you like it or not, but I'd rather you not. So, so pre-application, and then it goes through completeness review. This is where your staff is reviewing the documents, making sure everything's on them. Zoning Board of Appeals, if needed. Then you can send it out for a technical review. A lot of times we don't, but if you have a big project and say you need an engineer to review it, say you don't have a planner that's contracted anymore, or, you know, your staff needs additional help. And then it goes into this administrative review or planning commission review. So the administrative review is kind of new. Your current ordinance allows in your commercial district all your permitted uses to be approved by the zoning administrator, which is the only spot. It's kind of a weird location that it's even in. I'm a little uncomfortable with the way it's currently laid out. But this portion allows for your zoning administrator to do your review if it's a use by right. So it's just site plan review, 1,500 square feet or less, and then doesn't generate more than 500 trip ends. So you can do that administratively. They still are required to submit the full site plan, just like you would see at the planning commission, but the zoning administrator is reviewing it through the standards of approval and granting that permit instead of the planning commission. So this can help speed up some of those smaller projects to not have to come to planning commission. People don't have to wait a meeting or 2 meetings to be able to have their application reviewed. It is putting trust in your staff to make sure they're doing it right. That's a downside. And then the other, so if it doesn't go to administrative, goes to planning commission, the zoning administrator can always refer any application to the planning commission, even if it meets that criteria for administrative approval. So the site plans are approved by the planning commission, just like they currently are. So this is kind of just language talking about the approval process and that you're recording your decision and things like that. A lot of this is very kind of boilerplate language, I'm going to say. Nothing really changes from your current process. They're valid for 1 year. You can extend it for 1 year. They can be revoked. Added in here under 7.8C. This is new. It talks about expiration of an application. So if you're an applicant and you're not moving towards a decision or submitting new information, after 120 days, basically, we file your application away and said it's, it's a dead application, you need to reapply. And I've just found in some communities, you have applications that sit around for 2 years and
Yeah.
you're required to keep them and they're kind of in this weird spot. So this just says 120 days, you have to reapply. Your ordinance may even change in the process. So every time they're bringing in one piece of document, you're relooking at it brand new and it just continues on forever. And this does allow for reapplication. And it talks about amendments to the site plan. Any questions, comments, concerns?
The only question or suggestion I have or issue for discussion is that the pre-application conceptual review, that's all administrative. I understand there's a process, you can have administrative review. I don't see where the administrative process can be kicked over to the planning commission at any time or.
So it would be that in E, it's the second sentence, nothing in this section shall prohibit the zoning administrator or applicant from requesting the site plan review be submitted to the planning commission for determination.
Right,
Is that the one?
but that's already after you've gone down through this process, right?
Mhm.
In theory, you've gone through completeness, technical.
Right.
I mean, you're pretty far down the road at that
Right.
point. As opposed to like the pre-application where there's an opportunity to publicly air.
Oh, like a conceptual review, kind of like
Something.
what we did last month?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess this does not have that in here. We could add that in there.
I don't know if it's necessary for every project, but from a public perspective, I think that's good optics that people have a chance to see things.
Yeah, I'm wondering why I didn't add that in there. I don't mind it. I'll just add that in. Do you like requiring the pre-application conceptual review for site plans? Do you want it to be a shall instead of a may, or are you indifferent?
Have it to be a,
Like a shall, they do have to have this pre-meeting with staff.
I guess I get a little bit concerned if we make it too straightforward for somebody to come in front of the planning commission to kick around ideas without having vetted things through, and then we get stuck. And then every time it happens, it gets more and more ambiguous and vague, and then you end up getting stuck trying to, whereas I totally, can appreciate the fact of somebody coming in and having to do a lot of work before bringing it to us. So I kind of like trying to push it so that the zoning administrator has control over the process, making sure there's a complete application, and then there's always the possibility of saying, this particular piece cannot get completed until you get input from the planning commission or something, but unless I'm misinterpreting what
So
you're looking for.
the zoning administrator would have the option to say, I think this should go.
So you like it more like how we did it last month, where they had kind of a site plan, they've kind of been through part of the process to get here for conceptual review versus having someone draw on a napkin, this is what I'm thinking about doing, how do you feel
Right.
about it?
Yes,
Yeah,
because even the last month, it wasn't a napkin. It was fairly well thought out. There were some open things and I wasn't sure, so I get that, but we're trying to avoid the napkin stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's all, that's my only concern.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. It's very frustrating to get people, I mean, even when, not just conceptual, if they get to that point where all the things haven't been checked off, that's really frustrating when it gets here. So I think it would still be frustrating, napkin-based, kind of some of the things that we've seen you made it all the way through are kind of lacking information even.
So Sarah, what would be your judgment on that?
Well, let me see if there's language that makes sense, either how it's already drafted or if there's something we can add in for the procedural or application requirements that can get you to conceptual. Because like, for instance, with the last application, we don't have conceptual in our current ordinance, but I said, this is substantially complete. There's missing information still, but let's get this to the planning commission to get your eyes on it before you kind of go further in. Granted, that may have been a little bit generous in application to get to the planning commission for that experience.
You were the one that made that determination.
Right.
That the applicant could not.
Right. He kept pushing because he wanted to come to the planning commission and get your thoughts. And I said, without an application, you're not on the agenda. And you need to have a substantially complete application to get on the agenda. I'm not just going to put anything. You can't just fill out the application and get on the agenda. We need to have some substance to go with it. And so we kind of negotiated to how complete his application was to get to the planning commission.
So I guess bottom line is we don't want to give control of that to the applicant. The control of that, I think, needs to rest with the zoning administrator. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Ideally, our master plan is so fantastic and so clear that it's obvious.
Right. So let me work on some language and figure out how to fit it in there so we get
Okay.
something more than a napkin, but not all your permits are secured before you get to the planning commission, if it makes sense.
Right, that works.
Okay. So we'll add that in the process somewhere. Okay. Anything else for site plan review?
I like the idea of the visual workflow, something that with fewer words that someone can easily look at and know what's next. I like
Yeah.
that.
I was going to say the same
Agreed.
thing. I think it's a good organization.
Perfect. Okay, so special use approval is kind of short and sweet because it really refers back to your site plan review section in a lot of ways. It has its own standards, but the application requirements basically say, submit a site plan from Article 7. And then the approval process is the same, except for you have to have a public hearing in the process. And then any kind of amendments or anything is all the same. That's from Article 7. And what's nice about that is that you don't end up with two different requirements depending on what the approval process was, which can make it difficult. And so it's very intentional that it refers back to Article 7.
So just to make sure I'm tracking, so like when the air park has its Memorial Day thing, and they come through, we've had it 2 or 3 years now, I guess, that's a special land use permit, correct?
Correct.
So that would be this would be the new process to govern that.
Right.
So I think to that, when I'm looking at these general standards, it feels like we're missing something here. There is no mention of the master plan. And then it seemed like the standards we used before were more, there was one in there that was a little bit more of a catch-all. I think it had to do with the spirit and intent of the master plan and commensurate with benefits to the community or something like that. I can't remember how it was worded, but there was another one that,
So let me find it.
and when we
here.
looked at Dollar General, we used the same thing.
So special uses, your current standards for approval, yeah, a special use proposed must be consistent and promote the purpose and intent of the ordinance and zone district in which the use is proposed. Special use must be compatible with the zoning and adjacent land uses, must not adversely impact the environment, and must not unduly burden or exceed the ability of public services or facilities. So I'm thinking that the master plan and that, so you're required to meet the special use standards and those site plan standards in there. So let's look at in 7. Does it have all the information, site designs, compliance with the ordinance? So R in 7.3 says conformance site plan shall conform to all applicable requirements of state and federal statutes, the Torch Lake Township Master Plan, and approval must be conditioned on receiving state and federal permits. So your master plan language is actually back in the site plan part and not the special use. So they would have to meet that. It would have to conform with the master plan.
So when we reviewed Dollar General, we looked at the site plan standards.
Yes, in addition to the special use standards. So do our current site plan standards. Let's see what they say. So the current one talks about site plan shall be efficiently organized in relation to topography and the lot, and landscaping shall be preserved, trees and soils, stormwater shall be managed, site plan shall provide reasonable visual and sound privacy, emergency vehicle access, pedestrian circulation, loading, unloading, exterior lighting, water supply. So the current ordinance doesn't reference back to the master plan in any way for any of your approval standards for either site plan or special
Okay.
use. I think that's where like the neighborhoods, you're compatible with zoning and adjacent lands and purpose and intent of the ordinance. So you're kind of at a stretch there, but related back to the master plan. And I think the Dollar General, there were multiple things that they didn't meet, like they didn't meet some of the facade requirements and your pitched roof requirements and your window, like the glazing requirements. So some of the stuff they didn't meet was very basic requirements for site plan review in your ordinance, honestly.
They did say they
Yes.
would do whatever we wanted. though.
Yes.
But it seemed like we went through all of those, and it was the last one that was kind of the nuclear missile.
Yeah, and I can't remember. I think that your master plan, though, is covered better. I feel better about it in the draft than in the current language.
Okay.
If you wanted to, you could easily slip that into 8.2A
Yeah.
and purposes of this ordinance and master plan.
Yeah. I mean, I don't mind putting in there.
I like it
Okay.
to put that in there.
I'm going to say master plan or any other plan adopted by the township.
Nice.
I'll suggest one. but Not the meeting.
Okay. Anything else about special use? Okay.
Article 9.
Article 9, land development options. So I've just given you 3 land development options. Your current ordinance has, they've got PUDs and then like PRDs, which are planned residential developments. I don't recall it talking about open space developments or really too much about condominium subdivisions. So this ordinance, I just have plan development, open space, and condominium. A planned unit development can also be a PRD, a planned residential development. It's all the same stuff. It's just the uses that are in there. So I don't find it to be necessary to split them out in that way. For a PUD, This essentially lays out the flexibility of development of land in the township. And I'm not going to say it's a negotiation. It's, the applicant is providing something to the township in exchange for having flexibility in their design. Potentially, we haven't considered a use or a design or some requirement that they're looking to do through the PUD process. So this gives that ability to do that. But essentially, it's a special use permit that they have to go through and prove that they meet not only your special use and your site plan standards, but some additional standards for a PUD. But this process allows for kind of a two-phase. So they can go through and they have this PUD plan. Essentially, they're creating a master plan for the property. Just like as a community, we master plan for the whole township, they're master planning for the property. So they could be very broad in that process and say, over in this area, we're going to have commercial. This area is going to have residential. This is going to be open. What do you think? Looking for essentially a special use permit. They go through the public hearing process, they get approval for this master plan of the property. And then they can come back in the phases and essentially go through site plan review for construction of those phases. So when you're going through that process, you're not doing another kind of public hearing in that process. You're coming in and saying, okay, we told you we wanted to do commercial on this portion of the property. We're here with our commercial site plan for that. The use is consistent with whatever we told you we were going to put there, or broadly, they could say, we're going to put commercial uses which are consistent with your commercial district. And then they would have to pick one of those and go through that process to get it approved. It's kind of until you've been through the process for a PUD, it feels very overwhelming.
Well, I have two questions, kind of high-level questions. What led you to conclude to have the PUD, the OSPD, and the condominium subdivisions as the three types as opposed to other options that might be out there?
There's not really other options.
There aren't. Okay, well, that answers the question. Well, there is the red plan residential thing, but that
Right.
probably fits.
That's how, that would be the additional to split out residential from a PUD if you wanted to. The other way that you develop property is through land divisions, which are dealt with and handled under a different ordinance, a different state law, a different requirement to kind of fast track some of those. So if you split off a portion of your property and it meets the ordinance, you only can split so many times, right? So if you have 20 acres, let's go. If you have 10 acres, you can split it 4 times. With a PUD, you could come in and say, I have 10 acres and I want to split it 10 times. That exceeds what you're allowed to do under your land division, but there's a different process. Land division's handled in the office. The assessor, treasurer, and myself deal with it versus the PUD that has the public hearing and is a bigger process to go through.
Well, it certainly seems like it would be something that would help break something down into pieces. A big piece, a strategic piece to get kind of general buy-in and acceptance of it. And then sub pieces as you're working through each phase of it, like you said. Not that I'm going to advocate what I'm about to ask, but what would be, are you required to have these?
No.
And what happens if you don't have them?
You don't have the opportunity to develop your township other than through land division. So there's condominium subdivisions, which we'll talk about in a minute, but if you don't have a PUD, then it's just a straight up either land division or condominium subdivision.
Which is a lot harder from a development standpoint.
Right.
So this streamlines development.
In one way, yes. So I think that the golf course was approved as a PUD or PRD in the current ordinance. Let me
The
look.
Agami, you mean? I
Yeah,
assume?
Agaming is a PRD. So if you look at that development, and what that looks like, that's one way you could go about it. But if you didn't have the PRD process to go through, that type of development potentially wouldn't exist.
What do commission members think of that, one way or the other?
I feel like it gives a framework for someone to offer a development. It doesn't guarantee them a development, but it gives guidelines to come and make a presentation rather than trying to fit a square peg into a round hole somehow, you know? It's not a condominium.
That makes sense. Denise, what do you think?
I'm a little fuzzy, you want to know why, I'll tell you, but, so it's just a question so I can get some clarity. When we're doing the master plan, are we looking at the whole township and looking at current land use and possibly changing how land is used now and changing it to a different category? Is that something?
When you go through the master plan process, yes.
Okay. So, my question is, could we overdo this? I'm thinking if, through the master plan, if we define, okay, this area, we would like it to be these more planned, where maybe we're having smaller lots, more open space, more shared space, as opposed to, so it's the cart before the horse, but I think this can be overdone, and I think we have to be really careful. But because we are going to be doing the master plan, maybe we will more clearly define where this even could be a possibility. Am I thinking right on that? Okay.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So, and I mean, keeping in mind that in 9.2.4, there's some qualifying standards for your PUD when you're going through this process. So the intent is not to just get around zoning, that you're preserving open space, that you're compatible with your neighbors, providing alternative uses of parcels, you're providing buffers, you're still meeting the master plan. So it doesn't just give a free pass to somebody to do anything. And then included in this also talks about, you have to maintain at least 50% of the use that's in the underlying zoning district. So if you're in a residential district, at least half of your development needs to be residential. You could just use it to make it all commercial for that. So it's allowing flexibility with still holding some of those requirements. And it is a special use permit essentially. So if it's not compatible with your neighborhood, the planning commission could deny the application. But at this point, you would deny it at the kind of the conceptual time when they're telling you about, we want to generally have uses here, and this is the uses, and this is kind of what they look like, before they go through all the drawings for all the site plans and all the phases.
I mean, with what Denise just mentioned, I think it makes sense what she's saying, and I can understand, the cart before the horse type of thing. The one thing that gives me a little bit of comfort, though, because we already have stuff in the ordinance. It's not like there's nothing there, and all of a sudden we're putting these things in place. And we have the PUD, and we have, what was the other one? Planned resident,
The PRD.
PRD. So what is it that we're offering here, or not offering, but providing, I guess, the condominiums? Is there something specific about the condominiums? Are we streamlining more before we're ready to than what we currently have, maybe?
I don't think so.
You're expanding it, aren't you?
I think you're allowing more flexibility or more opportunity
With this or with what we currently have?
with the proposed.
So the PUD could be essentially any use by approval as opposed to the RD is residential only.
And I mean, I guess like I said, until you kind of go through the process, it's kind of hard to see how it's used. Like, for instance, in Garfield Township in Grand Traverse County, you know, like where the mall is and all of that. So like Home Depot, that's a PUD. That was approved as a PUD. Because their ordinance allowed it. A lot of the developments through there, I'll go through a PUD process because it allows some flexibility, but they're saying, oh, certain design requirements or standards that our ordinance doesn't say, they're putting into it. So, or where the movie theater, where Cherry Blossom movie theater is and Hobby Lobby, that's a PUD. A lot of the residential subdivisions are PUDs. So like Home Depot, you've got Home Depot and then there's apartments that are behind it. So you kind of have both commercial and residential. And then there's the single family that's just to the north of like Walmart. That's in a subdivision too. That's a part of the PUD. So they're kind of different phases, but they're all together. And people usually do them on larger chunks of property for development and do more of a mixed use. Not to say that you always would have to, but typically that's something like that. I don't know that in Torch Lake Township, you'll see a PUD application come through.
No, we did the golf course.
Right.
And there's some pretty good sized chunks up and down that are both commercial and real close by. There's some pretty good sized pieces. But whether those pieces, they're there and they have a process now, they could use the current PUD thing. I guess if, Sarah, you think that these are worded better and easier to manage and for us to have as tools to put in now as opposed to later, or some of them in now and some later.
I think it's a good tool to put in now. Nobody's going to use your current PUD process because it's just too kind of cumbersome to go through, and it's a little bit more limiting because you can only have certain uses in a PUD. 1 family or 2 family, 3 units or 4 units, and then some very limited commercial uses or golf courses or bed and breakfast, agriculture. So it doesn't really, it's almost more, it's very limited. I mean, I just don't see somebody using it to develop property because of the limitations on it. I mean, essentially it was written for the golf course at some time. I'm guessing either they put it in just before the golf course came in or knew it was coming or something like that, just because of the language. There's nothing wrong with that, but you can only have so many golf courses.
So I guess I'll just ask one more question of the commission though. So this potentially streamlines a process for broader types of development in the township. Do we want to do this now? Or do we wait until after the master planning process occurs and then reevaluate at that point? Because what I did hear you say, Sarah, was that is the current PUD is more restrictive. So by doing this, I guess I'm trying to get a sense for how much are we opening things up? And are we
Right.
ready for that before the community's had a chance to weigh in on what types of development do we want?
Right.
I didn't have any issue with it being in there.
Yeah, I mean, it is subject to the master plan as well. Whatever development you propose.
True.
Yeah, so even though the master plan need to be updated, it's still.
That's a
have
good
to be
point.
Consistent. I do have a couple of specific questions too. I don't know. Actually, one may relate to this. It's in 922C. Allowed uses not permitted in the district shall not occupy more than 50% of the developed area. So that would sound to me like, for example, if you're proposing a PUD in an agricultural area, you could only use half of what would otherwise be permitted.
No, the intent would say at least 50% of the uses that you're putting into your PUD would have to be uses that are listed in the ag district.
Okay.
So, and then the other half, or slightly less than half, could be uses that are listed in any other district or not currently listed at all. Like if you wanted to put, for instance, if you wanted to put up a wind farm, well, it's not allowed in our ordinance, right? And in the draft isn't going to be allowed. You could say, I want to, put residential in the ag district. I want to put residential on 75% of it. I want to leave, 50% of it. I want to leave 25% open, and I want to put a wind farm on the other 25%. That could be an application because they have residential is allowed. They're asking for a use that isn't currently allowed in the ordinance. This gives that opportunity to do that. But you're still backing it into the master plan and the zoning ordinance and the intent and the neighborhood. So it's not like just because they're proposing a use that's not in the ordinance, they get away with it. There's better be good justification for it. So that might be a bad example, but that's the only thing I can think of that,
That was a really good one, I thought.
yeah, we don't currently allow. But you would have to have at least 50% either residential. It could be a combination though. It could be residential, agriculture, and something else.
Mm-hmm.
Your 50%. But essentially, it wouldn't allow you to, have an ag property, call it a PUD, and put in self-storage for the whole
Mm-hmm.
property. How about we let you marinate on this one?
Yeah, Denise, what's your last? personal
No,
point?
I would be okay, I would be okay with this. And knowing that, there has to be compatibility with the master plan.
Yeah. Kevin?
I think Denise and Jeff have great points. I agree with you.
Yep, okay. No, I think we're good with it, Sarah.
Okay.
I have one more
I-
question.
Yeah, and I have a couple.
Oh, sorry. I
No,
didn't
go
mean-
ahead.
927A3L. Everybody get that?
2, 7, A, 3, okay.
Proposed buildings shall use traditional materials, and then we describe certain things that are out of bounds. Is there, I'm not necessarily saying I disagree with this, I'm not sure that I know exactly what traditional materials are, or specifically why we exclude EIFs or concrete.
Which one? What letter is it?
L, lady.
Oh.
I don't know. I mean, this isn't something that's in the current ordinance. I mean, the second sentence is intending to try to tell you what traditional building materials are by saying what's not allowed.
I guess I was
versus what,
asking, is
but
there some specific reason, or
I
whoever
think,
wrote this just had a hard time with modern buildings, I guess?
right. I mean, that's kind of where it comes from. The modern buildings, what they look like, to try to make them traditional, but whatever you'd like to see.
As I said, I don't know that I necessarily have a problem with it. I guess I would lean more toward something, consistent with the
The neighborhood or something.
neighborhood or the township, or, but if somebody wanted to build a big giant cement house, I don't know that it's.
Hey, you can print those now, right?
Could be interesting, you never know.
Did you want some tweaks to the language?
That's my suggestion. I'll
Yeah.
open it. I mean, others may disagree with me. And
Oh, I don't like to limit people on what they can use. You can do some pretty cool, great looking things with stuff you wouldn't expect.
Right.
But in this instance, they've got to come forward with a special use anyway, correct? So we're going to have site plan review and all of that. So if they come with some kind of, they're going to make a house out of trash.
Yeah.
We would have something to say about that.
Right.
It's not trash, it's just recycled.
Well, there's a difference
Upcycle.
between trash and some recycled things, at least I've seen. I have a question on 9.2.3. It talks about the standards about height, bulk, and density and setbacks and so on. But we don't have standards on density at this point, because that came up in our last.
Right,
So it seems a bit circular in that instance.
right. So some of the density though, even though for multifamily, we don't necessarily call out density, but density also means in your single family district, right? You can have a 20,000 square foot lot and you can have one home on that. So once you kind of go out and say, okay, that means I can have 2
Okay,
homes
so
per
it's
acre.
more in relation to like if you've got a 20-acre parcel and it's designated R1, you can only do so many
Right.
houses there. Okay,
Right.
that's what we mean by density.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, is the point that in the commercial or the village district, that's where the density gets a little squishy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's still a little bit there for density. Because if you go, yeah, so I would say like commercial. So say you were putting a PUD in your commercial district, we have a minimum lot area of 1 acre. But, you know, when you're doing commercial stuff in a PUD, you're not going to say, okay, well, you can have, if you have 20 acres, you can have 20 different commercial buildings, you know, because they could sit on 1 acre lots. Like it just doesn't work like that. It's definitely typically more related to residential. So in the village, we have 20,000 square foot for a minimum lot area. I guess all of our districts have 20,000.
Any other questions on Article 9? Hearing none. Article 10.
Okay, Article 10 is nonconformities. This is the same language that exists in your current zoning ordinance for nonconformities because we adopted it about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. We updated the language. So this is pretty much a cut and paste from your current ordinance.
We skipped over condominiums.
Oh,
We did. So an open space. So the open space development, you're required to maintain certain percentage of open space in your development. And then we have condominium developments, which are, they look like regular subdivisions, but now they're called condominiums. It's a form of ownership. But to most people, that's what your neighborhood looks like now. So these are required to meet your underlying zoning district. And so these would be something that are additional or instead of land divisions. So for instance, when you have that 10 acres and you could only split it legally under land division 4 times, this would allow you to split the property into 20,000 square foot lots, because that's what the zoning district allows for as many times as you can make it work. It is a special use permit. I don't think we've had any condominium subdivisions come through. At least not while I've been here. I'm trying to think of one.
well, the one that we had a month ago.
Yeah, but that's a traditional condo. Because those people would only own their buildings. They wouldn't own a lot.
Hmm.
So this essentially lays out so that you could create new lots as a subdivision.
There are quite a few requirements here, talking about the sort of size and shape of things. Are those,
Yeah, this is, I mean, trying to make it look more traditional, I guess, like a traditional subdivision. To me, when in the requirements that are here, because it talks about, I mean, some of them you have to say, they have to meet minimum lot size, have the setbacks, but then also having the right angles to the roads if you can, and things like that, to try to get it to look more like a platted subdivision. Take away your creativity.
So are we trying to take away creativity?
Essentially, it's requiring the lots to almost meet land division, but this only has a 2.5 times depth instead of land division has 4. So they're shorter lots.
Could somebody do a condominium development like this, be using the PUD path?
Yeah, so a PUD in the end is gonna end up being a condominium subdivision, essentially. I mean, we just don't, you approve it as the PUD. I can't really explain it, because it's a form of ownership. It's just the type of ownership that you have. So you either own, like your platted lot, you own to your property lines, a site condominium, you own 1/32 of the whole development, because that's what your parcel is. That's how your description is. And then if you have a traditional condo, you own the building and everything else is common area type of thing. So a PUD could be developed and it could go through traditional land division where you own to your property lines, but most of the PUDs are done as site condos because that's the easiest way to get it through. And we can't tell them what the ownership has to look like at the township level. So clear as mud.
So any
Right.
questions on condos section? Hearing none.
Nonconformities. Did anybody have any questions or concerns about nonconformities? Okay.
Nothing?
Article 12. So this is similar to your current ordinance. This is kind of your administration enforcement section. So it talks about, your zoning administrator responsibilities and then how we issue zoning permits, what zoning permits are required for that, when applications expire. This is also where you'll find your performance guarantees. So anywhere in the ordinance that reference performance guarantees, this gives you more detail on that. It also talks about your public hearings and then your violations of the ordinance. So if you violate the ordinance, you get a ticket, or we can file in circuit court to get you to cease and desist and resolve the issue.
So I have two questions. One is on 12.6. It says check with attorney.
Yep.
Has that been done?
That has not been done. My understanding is that townships cannot do this. But there are townships that do it. So I guess I don't know if they just do it and are hoping that something doesn't happen. So that's why I do need to check with the attorney still if there's interest in this requirement. So essentially, this is saying that if you owe any money, either in taxes or any other reason, you can't get a permit to do anything until you pay. Which in theory is nice because that makes usually the township whole before somebody's adding to their property or something like that. So if there's interest, I will check with the attorney on this.
Can you say that even if they apply, it just can't be approved
Right.
unless they pay?
Mm-hmm. Basically, it's
Oh,
like a
there-
conditional approval, like,
Oh, it's approval. It's
Yeah.
not saying that if you owe money, you can't even apply?
right.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you just not enforce it, right?
Right.
But it would brush people off if they think they have to pay their taxes.
Mhm.
My other question, Sarah, was, so the times over the last couple of years, say, when enforcement has become an issue, what challenges has the current ordinance provided or not provided, and how would this help?
Well, I think in general, not specific to this section, but in general, just having clearer language on some of the ordinance regulations. Because the violations and penalty section here is similar to what's in our current ordinance as far as what a violation is and that component of it, and how we enforce it. But it's just either having language that is actually enforceable in our ordinance, or clear, or doesn't contradict itself in another section. That will help with enforcement. I mean, there still will be things that we're not able to enforce or things that need to have a different ordinance to do enforcement. Like for instance, junk is in a different ordinance than the zoning ordinance.
Remember noise coming up quite a bit.
Yeah, and
We
I think
haven't-
the board's talked about noise quite a bit.
We looked at I think Bill provided a draft one from somewhere, but
Yeah.
we didn't resolve that, I don't believe.
Yeah, there wasn't interest at the township board level in adopting a noise ordinance.
There wasn't interest here.
Right, on the planning commission
Yeah.
either. Yeah. So, and that would, because that's outside of the zoning ordinance, technically that's outside of the purview of the planning commission. So the township board can ask you to draft or to help with language, but they're the ones that would have to kind of, I mean, the
Why-
zoning ordinance, they have to
Why
agree to.
would, if we said right now we want a zoning ordinance, why couldn't we develop one in part of this draft? We could, right?
A noise ordinance? Yeah, you could, but problem with noise is that it's tied to the use and it becomes non-conforming. Like zoning has non-conformities that police power ordinances don't have, which is why some of the things you go through the police power ordinance section so that you don't have that. But noise, you wouldn't be able to enforce noise just generally on you at your home in the zoning ordinance. Plus, the zoning ordinance is enforced by the township and not by the sheriff's department, and so you run into then enforcement on noise.
So you have to go get them.
Yeah. PC chair.
I think we always talk about ruling that one out. Enforce it.
Well, I'm not going to force it. Not my job, it's Sarah's job.
That was a tough one. I remember going through that one.
But where did the board leave off then?
They didn't have interest in adopting anything for noise.
Okay. Okay, all right.
Okay.
Anything
So-
else on Article 12?
I think it'd be good if we, on our website, I know this, we're not going over the website, but if we called it in here, what we call it on our website for fees. I think if you go to the forms for fees, it's something fees. I don't
Oh,
remember.
schedule of fees or
Yeah.
something, maybe?
Yeah, I just remember having a hard time finding it.
Okay.
Or maybe you could reference what it's going to be called or where to find it.
Yep.
You were talking about the fees or the penalties?
Fees.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember. I think it's schedule of fees.
I think you're right.
I wondered about the penalties too. It's hardwired in at $500 a day, which
$500 a day is the most that we can charge.
I see. Okay.
And that's still determined by the magistrate. Does it say up to? Yeah, not to exceed.
Not to exceed.
Yeah. Okay. The last chapter we have is definitions, and I guess I would suggest if we could hold off on definitions until our November meeting. We do have an application, but I think we'll have time to deal with definitions And what I would encourage you to do, definitions is one of the hardest chapters in the whole book because they're very boring and you can't apply them to anything most of the time, but is to look at them and see if, hopefully as you've been reading the draft, you're wondering, what does this mean? And you're saying, I'm missing a definition so that I can help define that for you. Or when you read through, go, is that how we want to enforce it? It is a little bit more difficult for the planning commission because you may not know what the current definition is. So you may have to sit down with your current ordinance versus the new one to see the differences between the two. But at the same time, it may not make a difference if you like the definition. You don't have to stick with something just because that's what's in the book right now. So, but we do try to, and I will double check always before we finally adopt it, is we make sure all of the uses that are listed in Article 3 have a definition for them. And then you'll find where there may be a definition that does not have a use related to it. Usually that's in the marijuana world. I still define them because then when somebody comes in and wants to apply for it, I say, no, the use is listed and it's not in any of the districts. Is how we deal with that. So sometimes if you look and you see a definition and you're wondering where that use is, it is intentional. Sometimes it's not, but most of the time there's a reason. But for definitions, if the word is not defined in the zoning ordinance, then you go to the dictionary to find that word, and you use the common dictionary definition for it. So we don't have to define everything if you're comfortable with what a dictionary says that word means. So essentially, it's if it's something that's different than what the dictionary.
So structure, is that a listed definition? I didn't go that far into it to remember.
Structure is in the zoning ordinance.
Itself.
By itself. It's on page 191. Anything constructed or erected, whether temporary or permanent, which I think is important because you're dealing with like those garages that are metal posts and tarps, and people saying that that's not an accessory structure because it's temporary. I say in zoning, it doesn't matter. Covers ground. Requires location on the ground or attachment to something having a location on the ground. And then it has a list of included. So fences are, walls are structures.
And again, the current one references rebar.
The current zoning ordinance, the definition of structure says, it doesn't currently say rebar, but you would use your zoning board of appeals. So the current definition says anything constructed or erected that the use which requires location on the ground or attachment to something having location on the ground. So it's similar to the proposed, but this talks about temporary or permanent, and then it goes on to list things that are structures.
So in this case, a seawall, even without rebar, would be a structure.
Correct, because it's a wall,
And a pile of rocks.
right? So we have a definition for a wall, an upright structure, typically constructed of wood, masonry, or stone material that encloses, divides, or protects an area.
Okay, so in our November meeting, we're going to go back and look at definitions.
Yes.
The other thing, Sarah, it seems like as we've gone through all of these articles that there was a few, maybe once a meeting or twice a meeting, there were some things that you were going to revise language.
Mhm.
It's probably, we should go over those. Kind of
Yes,
just go back through one, say, hey, it was, I guess if you could kind of walk us through, hey, in this particular article, this is one thing you wanted me to tweak.
So you want to go through the list that I've taken notes on before I actually make the changes? Is that what you're saying? Or you
No,
want
I
me to
think you'd make the changes and
then
then
come
you
back
just
and-
run them by us, and then I
Yep.
think we'd be complete.
Yeah. Yep, I agree. I think once we get through Article 14, you'll probably have to give me, I would say probably after the first of the year, if we do this in November, I'll come back so that I can have, I'll get you like a new draft by the middle of December, give you some time to read through it again. But I can also let you know where changes were made, so you don't have to read the whole thing.
Yeah, I think that would be just like a big fat yellow. These
Yeah.
are the ones where specifically, we asked you to go back and
Yep.
make tweaks because we couldn't solve it right then.
Right, yes. So that would be how we would move forward once we get through definitions, is coming back with a complete draft again, do a quick review. Anything we still need to talk about, and then move it forward to a public hearing.
So do we, before we can move it forward to a public, do we have to go through that final? Can we do any of that in parallel, I guess?
Not really. So the public hearing needs to have the final draft available for it, so we wouldn't be able to make the edits for it. I don't know if there's anything that you feel like we need to get input on before you kind of get to a more finalized draft, that you'd want to have a public hearing on something specific. Or if you just say, hey, wait till a complete draft's done, see what shakes out, and then maybe you'd have further discussions on some items. You know, the final.
No, I'm thinking
the final-
we've had these meetings and they've been published and people have
Right.
had opportunities to come forward.
Mhm.
So I think my question was just more of trying to, because we're through this, you
Right.
get your final tweaks made, we review them, we're good with it, then we wait and have the public hearing and then the
Mm-hmm.
review. I guess that's fine. So I think what we'll try to do is in our January meeting, finalize it.
Right.
And then we can do the public hearing and then in February, move it to, I guess, forward for the board, correct?
Right. Yeah, so what I'll do then too is when we send it to the county, we will send it to the township board at the same time, so they have time to read it and digest it, and as we wait for the county comments to come back.
And then I think the only other piece is for the November meeting that we will, if we have time, I guess probably we'll wait till December. The December meeting, really want to spend some concentrated time on kicking off master plan, or at least
Yeah.
the plan for the master plan.
Right. Yeah, you know, I
Because we're
could,
going to use that $15,000 that we've got to start engagement, whatever that means.
yeah. So I could put it on the agenda for November, like, you know, master plan discussion, like master plan kickoff discussion, and if we get to it, then we get to it. If we don't happen to get to it, we'll take it up in December. I don't, you know, it's a couple months out, but I don't think we'll have anything else on the agenda for December, so we could have some discussion about it. But it would be nice to get a little bit of guidance because, you know, I could come to a December meeting potentially if we have a discussion in November with some survey questions and examples that we can start to discuss and build off of to get that survey out versus just having a discussion and coming back in January with, this, you know, might be able to get 1 month started if you're like, yeah, let's do a survey. We want to make sure we touch on this, this, and this to come to December.
I think the other thing that would be helpful is if you were to come, especially in December, with kind of a proposed process of what would this look like? Okay, there's the survey, here's some sample survey questions, but here's other elements of the master planning process. There's like
Yeah,
8 things that you do.
yeah,
Some are serious, some in parallel, and we have a sense for that and how we can go about managing through that process.
okay. Kind of like a timeline and different components.
Timeline and how would we go about getting it done? And
Yep.
how, you know, potential budget considerations so that we can start teeing that up for the fiscal year.
Yep,
Because that ends in what, March?
yeah, end of March.
So if we can so we can use some of that, the money we have to not only maybe start getting our arms around the survey, but even to the extent if we want to engage somebody to help us through this process,
Other
We
than
could-
myself.
other than yourself. Well, unless you're going to manage and coordinate the survey and everything. I mean, that's a question. I mean, I think we have to just think about what have other communities done? How
Right.
does that look like?
You're not obligated to use my services.
Well, no, I understand that. So, anything else on the proposal going forward?
Is it, just for a process question, sorry, is the zoning map part of the master plan process, or has that already been?
The zoning map, it will be a part of this zoning ordinance. We didn't make, the only changes to the zoning map that were made have to do with the village business and village residential zoning district. Being that we actually shrunk the village business district down to where there are only parcels that have frontage on those roads, instead of extending it back into some of the neighborhoods. And we did that because after the master plan, we're gonna have to circle back to the zoning ordinance anyways. And so we were gonna start some of those discussions about if properties are properly zoned once we get through the master plan.
Thank you.
Anything else on the main new business items? Not any public comments? Hearing none. May I have a motion to adjourn tonight's meeting?
So moved.
May I have a second? Discussion? All in favor? Aye. Meeting is adjourned at 8:39 PM.